northwest of Hudson Bay, along the northern shore of the American continent and southward to the tree line hundreds of miles away, lies an immense open tundra. The feel of the tundra is that of a vast mountaintop, the same exhilarating wind-clad space, low scudding clouds, and the peculiar silence, almost audible in its intensity, that exists only where there is no tall growth for the breeze to ruffle. It is a severe country, but one of more like beauty and dramatic change. In 1963, Briggs, an anthropologist from Washington, D.C., travelled north and spent 17 months with a small group of Canadian Inuits, the Utku, who lived nomadically, the only people in an area covering some 35,000 miles. The nearest settlement, another Inuit trading post, was around 150 miles away. The Utku spent the summer in tents and the winter in igloos, fishing and hunting caribou. Initially, Briggs had intended to study shamanism, but found that the Utku had abandoned their paganism in favour of Christianity. Instead, she studied their emotions, published Never in Anger in 1970, and spent her life documenting the culture and lives of the Utku. She published the first Utku dictionary in 2015, and she passed away the following year. Since the Enlightenment, the idea, the concept of rationality has been positioned up high in a place of privilege, meant to justify certain behaviours while delegitimizing or rejecting others. The great men of state led their people precisely because they were born rational, just as some races and countries were natural, rational leaders. Take up the white man's burden, Kipling urged America, while the influential liberal John Stuart Mill argued that the benevolent despotism of the British in India was justifiable as a civilizing process. The savage, he wrote, cannot bear to sacrifice for any purpose the satisfaction of his individual will. Savages banging drums in emotive fervour were essentially children, and women too, even in the West of course, were best kept out of politics in case their emotions ran wild. These beliefs assumed two things. First, that some groups were specifically more or less emotional than others, and second, that emotions are ingrained biologically in the body, hardwired, ready to be activated. To be educated was to learn to control your emotions. They were natural, but part of the primitive nature to be tamed by culture. In 1939, some 20 years before Briggs travelled into the Arctic Circle, the German sociologist Norbert Elias published The Civilizing Process. It became a classic sociological text. Elias believed that the history of Western society was one of a gradual linear progression from emotion to reason, with humans slowly learning to control their lower faculties. Pre-modern man had no invisible wall of affects, which seems now to rise between one human body and another, repelling and separating. Europe made men out of savages. Emotions were hardwired in the brain, but could be suppressed. This rational emotional dualism assumes that emotions have a universal component that applies to all people, in all places, at all times. For those who believe that history controlled emotions, this must mean that the emotions in people are the same everywhere, only that some cultures have learnt to tame them more than others. In the Arctic, Briggs observed that for the Utku, growing up meant acquiring a humour, or reason, but the way this developed was different to what she was used to back in Washington. Children, for example, were allowed to indulge in more emotional outbursts than American children without being disciplined. In fact, children were hardly disciplined at all when it came to emotion. Crying, tantrums, anger were all accepted. A humour is meant to arise naturally, the Utku thought. Once adulthood arrived though, displays of anger, emotional outbursts became unacceptable. Morally, culturally, there was nothing worse than outward displays of emotion. This became apparent to Briggs not through observing like a detached scientist, but through her own emotional behaviour. She had trouble adapting to the cold and struggled with the language. As winter came and the temperature dropped to -50, she became irritated. She cried occasionally and let out occasional bursts of profanity. She interfered with Utku norms in ways she shouldn't have and slowly became marginalised, slipping into months of depression. The leader of the group, Inutiuk, was a particularly intense person who kept strict control of his feelings, although, Briggs wrote, you were aware that something was being controlled. This was what regulated respect, justified his leadership. His status was a product of the way he controlled his emotion. The Utku said that a man who never lost his temper could kill if he ever did become angry. Emotional control in harsh conditions was the central component their moral economy revolved around. This was a golden era of social construction and anthropology, and in 1977, American anthropologist Catherine Lutz travelled to the Ifaluk Atoll in the Pacific Ocean. She observed a similar phenomena to Briggs. Emotions not only had a different character than those in the West, but they also worked to regulate society in some way. Lutz wanted to deconstruct emotion, to show that the use of the term in both our everyday and social scientific conversation rests on a network of often implicit associations that give force to statements that use it. The Ifaluk were a matriarchal society, and Lutz found that one emotion, fago, was central to their culture. Those who led were thought of as having more fago, an emotion Lutz argued was unique to the Ifaluk, but can be loosely translated as somewhere between compassion, love, and melancholy. The Ifaluk are a face-to-face culture with no written language. Life on the atoll was tumultuous, typhoons and crop failures were common, and Lutz found that fago was a response to that fragility. The term, though, was in quite wide use. One woman had fago for a person singing a beautiful song. Another woman told her husband, who drank too much, that he did not fago her thoughts. Fago was also used to describe homesickness or the feeling of missing a deceased loved one. Lutz argued that primarily fago was used to describe a link between two people, one in need and the other with a duty to respond. The needs could be quite varied, some emotional, some physical. Fago then was also a moral concept. It's also not just a temporary emotion, but something someone might have as a general character trait. Lutz argues that fago is a reflection of the fact that the worst thing to be on the Ifaluk Atoll is without kin, which represents both economic and social support and survival. Connection is fundamental. Fago was used in some way to shame people when they'd done wrong. "You don't have fago for me," one woman said. And so is a form of cultural currency, in some ways reflecting status and respect. Like the Utku, regulating emotion in some way was central to the Ifaluk. Unlike the Utku though, regulation wasn't a form of suppressing something, but of expressing something. Importantly for Lutz, emotions weren't pre-cultural, but preeminently cultural. The lesson, she says, is that emotion should be seen as a response to environment and society as much as biology. The traditional view of emotions in the West still remains relatively dominant, that we have basic emotions somewhere neurologically wired into our brains that are tripped like switches when we encounter certain things in the world. But this view is being increasingly challenged. Emotions, it turns out, also have a history, have their environments, are influenced by society and culture in some way. The historian Rob Bodice, in arguing for a biocultural view of emotions, writes that humans are not mere sacks of DNA passively encountering the world around them and experiencing what is objectively and materially out there. Everything we experience is filtered through context, custom, cultural scripts and taboos before being checked against what we know from the past, in our own lives and through what we know about more distant pasts, and projected outward from the brain as if automatically as our construction, our interpretation of what is happening and what that feels like. And similarly, psychologist Lisa Barrett and others are challenging the basic view of emotions with a psychological constructionist account. In Barrett's 2017 book, How Emotions Are Made, she argues that emotions are not single concepts in the brain, but are constructed out of basic psychological ingredients that respond to both differences in environment and culture, and memories and past interpretations. In other words, emotions are constructed on the fly. each time you experience them and relative to other experiences. These are accounts that aim to bring the biological and the social together in some way, acknowledging the plasticity of the brain. Briggs returned to the Utku several times, also making trips to Alaska and Siberia. She wrote her second book, Inuit Morality Play, on how children were taught self-control with playful questions meant to ridicule the display of emotions like anger. One essay was titled, "Why Don't You Kill Your Baby Brother?" When she first planned her trip back in the 60s, all her colleagues told her not to go, that it was too far off the beaten track, the conditions too harsh, even, they said, for a man. Thank you to Aghast for providing the incredible music for this video, plus this great song you're hearing right now. Check out his SoundCloud through the link in the description below. It's really, really good. If you like these videos and want to support Then and Now, then here's my request. If you think you get as much value from 4 of these videos as you do from just 1 cup of coffee, then please consider pledging just $1 towards the creation of each new video on Patreon, where you can even limit your pledge to just $1 per month. If you subscribe below, then please make sure to hit that bell to make sure you get alerted to new videos, and you can follow me on Twitter and Facebook in the links in the description below. Thanks to all my existing Patreons, and see you next week.